My name is Vidhya Ramalingam. I am founder and CEO of Moonshot. We are an online safety organization working to prevent violence across the whole harms landscape. Our origins were in terrorism prevention. That was my background, my co-founder Ross's background before starting Moonshot. And then over the years, we've expanded to cover a much wider range of harms. We're a team of 80 based across 4 offices, London, Dublin, Toronto, and Washington, D.C. Some of you will have attended some of the panels and various talks that my colleagues from Moonshot who are here have done throughout the few days. So shout out quickly to Antonia, Lily, Blythe, and Teresa Raja. You guys might have met them around over the last couple days. Hopefully this is going to work for me. Maybe not. There we go. It isn't. It's supposed to be blank by intention. Moonshot hit its 10th birthday last year in September. And as I think anyone does on milestone birthdays, it was a real moment to pause and reflect about what we had done over the past 10 years, what are the things that we had achieved, but also what are the things we hadn't achieved or which we were still frustrated by, and where we were going, where we were heading. Because Moonshot itself is only a little bit older than TASM, I wanted to use this talk as an opportunity to really reflect on all of us as a sector, where we have come in the prevention of terrorism and extremism online. And just bearing in mind, I've worked with many people in this room in different capacities, even prior to my Moonshot days. I know that there's a lot of collective knowledge and a lot of collective testing and a lot of collective learning that has happened over the last, even 20 years on this. When we founded Moonshot in 2015, it was because we saw a gap. Nearly every recent act of terrorism and targeted violence at that stage in Western nations had first passed through digital spaces. And yet, our violence prevention systems remained stubbornly offline. That disconnect was leading to missed opportunities, preventable tragedies, missed warning signs, moments that we could have intervened with somebody who was on the path. And so what this meant was we as a sector needed to build something we didn't have, which was a way to reach people in online settings who were presenting risk of violence before any conventional offline violence prevention program might actually stumble across them. So in the early years, the sector's first set of responses, going back to 2010, 2012, largely focused on countering the narrative, Moonshot included. And I thought about flashing up some images of early counter-narrative campaigns that folks in this room, or even myself and Moonshot, were involved in, but it felt too embarrassing to go back and reflect on those days. It was like looking back at your high school, essays that you wrote and realizing how much you didn't know. In 2015, our first big project as Moonshot was in partnership with Google, and it was to redirect users who were consuming ISIS content online away and towards, drumroll, counter-narrative videos. We spent almost exclusively, the first year of Moonshot almost exclusively was spent trialing counter-narratives online. And looking back at that time, we as a sector weren't applying all of the knowledge and evidence that we knew that we had from offline settings. We knew in offline settings that behavioral health methods that focused on the connection between behaviors and overall physical and mental well-being, so approaches like social work, clinical psychology, mental health support, all of that, the provision of wraparound services, we knew that that was far more effective than getting into discussions about the ideology. And yet, we frankly wasted a lot of time as a field debating with people about the ideology online. And the data just told us time and time again, well, either those programs weren't evaluated, and that was the case for a lot of programs. Again, Moonshot included, some of our early efforts weren't evaluated as they could have or should have been. And as we started to hit on that realization, we started trialing both. So we, at the same time as running our counter-narrative campaigns, we started also doing behavioral health messaging online. And we found consistently, this is data from going back 10 years ago, this is from 2016, Consistently, we found behavioral health methods were far more effective in online settings. Some of the earliest data from our experiments on the left, yeah, that's your left. On the left is data from reaching out to audiences consuming Salafi jihadist content, specifically ISIS content at the time in Indonesia. This is just one of many data points that we came across when we were trying counter-narratives and mental health messaging, consistently found, and in this case, the audiences were 47% more likely to click on offers of mental health support than they were to click on counter-narrative content. White supremacist audiences in the US, we tested mental health messaging with people consuming neo-Nazi, white supremacist content, and we tested that against the general public. And what we found was consistently people consuming neo-Nazi content were far more likely to click on mental health offers of support and self-help content than the general public were. And that increased even higher if it were people who were seeking to join extremist organizations. At the time, we were looking at people looking to join groups like the KKK. If we were to do this experiment today, it would look very different. But beyond Moonshot and just reflecting on the whole sector and what we all collectively learned through years of trialing, testing, research done by many people in this room, we learned that hate can be an indicator of emotional suffering, that ideology can fall away when the underlying drivers are addressed, that for most, violence is circumstantial and not pathological, which means we can do something about this. And we learned that anyone is capable of violence, but also most are capable of leaving it behind. Again, there is an opportunity for us here. We also learned that people are willing to talk about their violent thoughts, if asked, in a non-judgmental way, and they seek help. And we also learned that collaboration is essential to prevent violence, that this cannot be done by one organization, one entity, one part of the field alone. It has to be done as a collaboration. That shift from countering the narrative to a public health approach to violence prevention was critical. It was huge for our field, and the fact that we don't even need to defend this anymore. This is now just understood by so many around this room. I mean, almost every panel that I attended at TASM, this was just the baseline assumption. We didn't need to hash this out at the beginning. The public health approach treats violence like it's a health crisis, so it focuses on the whole population to understand root causes, identify those risk and protective factors, and stop harm before it escalates. And many of you will be familiar with this pyramid: primary prevention at the bottom, secondary prevention, and then tertiary prevention, which is really responding after the harm has occurred. I want to focus today on activities that fall within secondary prevention. So this is really the area where we are doing early intervention with those who are at risk. There are critical intervention points for us at every stage of the online journey into violence. And if there is one takeaway that I can leave everyone in the room with, if you don't already believe this, I want this to be the one takeaway for you, that there is always an opportunity to intervene right up until the moment somebody picks up a weapon, and I would even argue right up until the moment that they actually carry out the act of violence. Earlier in the UK, some of you will have read this story in the news or maybe have even been involved in this. From a government perspective, earlier this year, the UK sentenced a 17-year-old in Merseyside who had been immersed in online incel cultures. He had idolized killers like the attacker in Southport, and he had stashed a collection of knives and had ideas for targets, multiple targets. On 6th of August last year, he gathered 4 knives in his backpack, and he got ready to leave his home to carry out an attack. But his family had locked the doors and the back gate of the garden, so he couldn't get out of his back garden. The gate was locked. What did he do? He called 999 emergency services on himself. So he called emergency services on himself as he was preparing to carry out an attack. He told them what he had been planning to do so that they would stop him. I found that story so remarkable because even at the point at which this individual was getting ready to travel and do an attack, he had his weapons with him. Even at that point, all it took was the back garden being, the gate in the back garden being locked. Can you imagine? Like, if that gate had not been locked, people could have died. It was that simple. A locked gate was all it took for him to turn his back on his plans and go seek help. The insight that defined the focus of our work over the last decade was just that the most powerful intervention isn't contesting what somebody believes, it's meeting them where they are emotionally in that moment, wherever they sit on this journey, on this pathway to doing something violent. And we have to meet them at that moment at every stage, because they may not take up the offer of assistance at the early stage, but they might just, and we have to hope that they might just, take up that offer of assistance at a later stage in the journey before it's too late. Our theory of change: if we reach people consuming violent content online, and we make those offers of support, usually it's asking them questions about their emotional state, about feelings of anxiety or even loneliness, and offering help. If they choose to engage with those offers of support, and if they're really in need, and if they choose to speak one-to-one with a trained clinician, then that clinician can assess their risk, can build a support plan around them, connect them into wraparound services that can help them, and that will ultimately lead to a reduction in individual risk, and ultimately, when applied at scale, and this is our theory of change, will reduce the threat of violence fueled by online spaces. I'm going to come back to this at the end of my talk, because I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about success and what success actually means, what it did mean for Moonshot, and what I think it actually needs to mean in the future, because I think we all collectively as a community need to ask ourselves some pretty tough questions about what our actual goal is here and what's possible to achieve. Before I get there, what this looks like in practice, and forgive me for those of you that are familiar with what we do, but I think there are some people who are not familiar, so I want to just quickly walk through this. You meet people at that moment online, wherever it may be, if they are watching an extremist video, when they are writing a post that glorifies terrorism, when they are liking a post that dehumanizes minorities, when they are searching for a terrorist video, or perhaps even when they are in conversation with a chatbot wanting validation for violence. You show them an offer of assistance, whether it's through an advertisement. We tend to use advertising a lot, but also we have done this through interstitials in partnership with tech platforms. We've done this through content placements, us just posting offers of support, or other means. They click to access online resources, and there's a lot they can access online, but then there's always the possibility to speak to a clinician. All of those services, and this is so important, are operated and managed by local organizations. I can't emphasize that enough. This is not Moonshot. That's the point at which Moonshot's support and role ends, is the moment that somebody actually seeks to access clinical support, and they're engaging directly with a local organization that in most cases have decades of experience supporting complex cases. We tend to work with family violence organizations a lot. These are organizations that can really provide that full range of wraparound services for somebody who might be at risk. And again, they don't need to know the details on the ideology in most cases. They just need to be able to assess the underlying drivers of violence. So we spent the last 10 years going from pilots, experiments, to now building out large-scale multi-year programs with various governments, sometimes in partnership or not in partnership with tech companies. And today, some of our models have now been operating for 4 or 5 years. That said, to complicate matters, as we've been delivering this, the problems have changed around us. So what has changed? And I put this on the screen knowing that there's tech companies in the room with us, with all due respect to industry in the room, because we need you here. We need the people who are here from various tech companies, AI companies, et cetera. The people in this room who are here they truly represent the best of the best at these firms. Many of you have worked with them for years. They are fighting the good fight internally on all of our behalfs to make better things happen inside these companies. All of that said, reflecting on 10 years of Moonshot experience, our partnerships with these tech companies, you all have seen the major pullback on investments in trust and safety. I have seen prevention efforts, both ones that we operated, but also dear partners of ours. I've seen those prevention efforts and the funding for those from tech companies dramatically drop on a moment's notice, almost overnight. And for organizations in this room, or if you've worked with organizations in this room who are delivering life or death services, that's not going to cut it, right? That's just not going to cut it. I have seen those programs drop overnight because share prices dropped overnight for a company. So there's just a difference in the incentives and the context in which decision-making can happen in that environment. And so we need to look at, squarely in the eye and think through, okay, if we cannot rely solely on partnerships with tech companies to make this happen, what are all the things that we can do without relying on them that will ensure there is a safety net there if something goes wrong and if the platforms and the tech companies are not in a position to uphold their end of the bargain? Second shift. You all have been discussing this for the last 2 days, so I'm not going to hammer this too hard, but ideology is no longer central to online radicalization pathways. So what that means is when you're reaching people online and you're really trying to reach someone who is at risk of extremism or at risk of perpetrating harm, violence, we can't just do that on the basis of reaching out to people consuming content that's affiliated with a specific ideology. So what it's meant for us is we've had to expand to reach out to people consuming gore content, sexual violence content, ensuring that we're in spaces and forums where NVE actors are preying on people. But that leads us to a third challenge, which is that general exposure to all of that content that I just mentioned is at its highest today. You all know how quickly videos of mass shootings are shared. A large portion of the general public don't even want to see this content and they stumble across it. In New Zealand, and I'll talk through some of our work in New Zealand in a moment, in New Zealand, the classification office there just released data that indicates 66% of the entire New Zealand population report having seen this content online, and many of them stumbled across it without intending to watch it. So the challenge for all of us is if engagement with that content no longer is a reliable signal of risk, what does that mean for how we assess risk online? What does it mean for how we target interventions? So what we've had to do at Moonshot is expand our goal. So today, when we are reaching out to people exposed to or engaging with extremist content online, we can have no assumption that they may pose a risk of violence, because it might actually just be, my mother who has had violent extremist content sent to her on WhatsApp. And my mother is not a violent extremist, just for clarity. But people like that have been exposed to something that could actually really harm them. And there's a lot of evidence and lots of research. I assume some folks in this room may even themselves have done research on the effects of exposure to violent content. It's associated with secondary traumatic stress symptoms, so we know it creates harm. So if we reach out to people and we have no expectation they might pose a risk of harm, but we still believe they deserve access to services, then great, we're providing services to the general public. But how are we also going to get creative with reaching people who are truly at risk? We're going to come back to that in a moment. I want to just quickly share a couple examples of this in practice. So for the last 2.5 years, we've been operating a program in New Zealand, and this is in partnership with the government of New Zealand and in partnership with a wonderful family violence organization called RISE that have been operating for 30 years supporting New Zealand communities on family violence. We have several folks from New Zealand here, including the Christchurch call team, so I don't need to remind everyone of the horrific attack that New Zealand experienced in March 2019. We were tasked by the New Zealand government to build on what was happening internationally, help bring that to New Zealand, and develop a model in partnership with RISE that would bring RISE's services, their family violence prevention services, up to anyone who was consuming violence-inciting content online. In the first year of delivery, we learned so much about communities engaging with violence online in New Zealand. So this is data from across 4 platforms. We found New Zealanders engaged with this content over 260,000 times across those 4 platforms over the course of a year. New Zealand has a population of 5 million people, so 260,000 times that people in New Zealand engage with that content is a lot. We found a large portion of the audience engaging with this content was likely made up of youth, and we also found that nearly half of that engagement was with gore content. So again, thinking beyond traditional extremist ideologies and recognizing there's lots of pathways to exposure to harm online. We made over 250,000 offers of support through advertising to people consuming this content over the course of a year. And what happened from there? Over 6,000 engagements with those offers of support, just under 1,000 people engaged with website services, with accessing just the digital content on that website, and 47 people in need accessed clinical support. Moving across the ocean, across the globe to Canada, where we were delivering this model for the last 4 years. We've seen similarly high engagement by youth audiences, increasing fascination with gore. We've seen high engagement with anti-Semitic and incel content. And over 2 years, we made just under 1 million offers of support to those consuming this content, saw over 8,000 engagements with offers of support, and 77 people accessing clinical support. A few years ago, I got a call as we heard from our clinical partner in the US that they were able to intervene and stop a planned attack by an individual. Through engagement with an individual, our clinical partners believed lives were imminently at risk. They engaged law enforcement and emergency services to stop a planned attack and save lives. When that story came through from that team, I remember thinking, if Moonshot were shut down today, I can sleep at night knowing we did that one thing. Like, if that is all that Moonshot ever achieved, then I will, and I'm getting a bit emotional as I think about it, then I will know that we did something, right? However, at our 10-year anniversary in September, as I was pausing and reflecting on our work, I found myself thinking, is that enough? Is that actually enough? Is that our measure of success? Is that a scalable measure of success? Sure, attacks prevented is an incredible metric if you can get that data, but the ability to actually arrive at that conclusion that your program prevented an attack that was going to happen, that is so rare. It's also, for many people in this room, so challenging, if not just not possible, based on the structure of our programs or even our theories of change. The causal link between your program and something not happening is, as you all know, proving a negative. It's very difficult. We are all getting asked, and rightly so, to evidence the return on investment for our prevention work. We're getting asked really good questions about that. And so we need to ask ourselves whether we're getting the metrics right. My view on what we at Moonshot have achieved through this work over the past 10 years, and I'm just going to bring it down to a really modest level here. What I can say with confidence Moonshot has done is we have validated that people in some of the internet's most hostile spaces will voluntarily seek help when offered accessible, non-judgmental pathways. And in the process of validating that point, yes, we know some lives were saved, but I just want to break it down to a really modest contribution to the field, which is just validating that it's possible. That foundation took 10 years to build. And that foundation is why it matters now to ask ourselves harder questions. The field is under pressure to produce evidence that its own prevailing methods have oftentimes been structurally challenging to actually generate. And I think we all have a shared evidence problem. So 10 years in, the harder question that I'm wrestling with is, have we actually been measuring what matters or what was appropriate for an earlier stage of the field's development? In delivering online prevention, we do have access to a lot of data. These are just some of the metrics and measurement points that we use in our work. Each of these have their own value and their own meaning, their own time and place. But even the value of any one of these metrics, and I'll read them for folks that may not be able to see it in the back of the room, we have impressions, actually maybe I'll explain what impressions are. Impressions demonstrate the number of times that we interrupted an attempt to engage with violence online. We have impression share, which demonstrates our efficacy at getting an advertisement shown or getting a post seen that offers support. We have our click-through rate, which demonstrates how effective our messaging was at encouraging somebody in need to click on an offer of support. We have our average time on the website, which demonstrates how compelling the service websites are. We have our returning visitor rates. We tend to find a lot of visitors return to the website. Again, they're just thinking about whether or not they want support. And then on the bottom here, and the one that we emphasize the most, is engagement with services. It demonstrates people who were truly in need were actually able to seek help from a clinician in a moment of need. These metrics, as I said, have a time and a place, a value, a meaning in certain cases, but it varies. And I'll give you an example. So click-through rates, that metric, as I said, it measures the efficacy of our messaging to get somebody to click through onto an offer of support. As we've run newer experiments and refined our approach, the methodology has rendered this metric way less useful. In early days of Moonshot, and if we have partners in the room, maybe even funders in the room who paid Moonshot to run programs like this, we would have really focused on click-through rate. And I'm going to give you an example of where click-through rate is absolutely meaningless. As a methodology, we now know that repeat messaging is so critical to encouraging somebody to seek help. I read out that example from Canada, 5 attempts to get that person to actually set up a phone call before they turned up. Well, we started delivering in our campaigns, we started ensuring that people would see the offer of services multiple times, so up to, in some cases, 5 times a day, really just trying to encourage that person in their moment of need to actually take up services. In the more extreme corners of the internet, 4chan boards, for example, we ran this approach consistently for 10 months. In 10 months, we got 389 people, this is in the US, 389 people within the US accessing services from reaching out on 4chan over a 10-month period. Now, you saw the results from the programs in Canada and New Zealand that I mentioned, 47 people in New Zealand over a year, 77 people in Canada, so 389 people in the darkest corners of the internet seeking help in 10 months is pretty remarkable. In order to get that, to achieve that, we had to show our offers of support 36 million times. That is a 0.001% click-through rate. But, as I mentioned, the click-through rate is not the point, right? And just to explain this, we were reaching likely up to 30,000 US-based users who were engaging with violence every day with our offer of support. And we capped the number of times that they saw the offer of support 5 times. In those spaces, flooding the space, repeated messaging, that is what will get people to actually take up offers of support. And you can see a quote here. This is shared with us by our service provider partner on that program. This is user feedback from an individual who was on 4chan consuming extremist content and accessed care, and then wrote into them, "Thanks for giving me the space to talk through what was going on, and for gently reminding me about the strengths and resources I already have." All to say, these metrics are nuanced. They matter in changeable ways. And I know there are other metrics that we can and could explore here, but the bottom line here is the number of people accessing clinical services, which is something that we've emphasized so much. It's been our main goal. It's the right starting point. It's just the starting point. It gave the field a credible, concrete anchor at a time when this methodology and any online prevention efforts were really just establishing their legitimacy with governments and other partners. It demonstrated that you could get someone from engagement with violence online into a direct conversation with a clinician. And that mattered. I don't want to say that doesn't matter. That mattered, and it shouldn't be understated. But the field has moved, and I believe what counts as rigorous measurement needs to move with it. The number of referrals is often framed as a way of measuring outcomes at the last stage of a kind of causal chain in the online space. But that undersells the value and the possibility of everything that comes before the point at which somebody takes up the opportunity to speak to a clinician. There are so many other outcomes that we should be seeking and measuring in our work, and I say our inclusive of Moonshot, but I also say it to the field, in order to have longer-term the impact that we want to have with audiences online. If the impact we want to have is measurable reduction in online facilitated violence at the population level, we collectively need to expand our ability to measure these kinds of programs across much more nuanced outcomes. Ultimately, change doesn't happen in a single step, right? It happens in stages, in a sequence. And so every single stage of that sequence has value, and there will be associated metrics and outcomes that need to be measured as part of that. Just to name a few: shifts in awareness that support is available, reduction in stigma associated with help seeking, increased motivation to change, increased capacity to self-regulate one's online behaviors, improved emotional regulation and coping strategies, reduced frequency of harmful content consumption, cognitive shifts, attitudinal shifts, sustained behavior change. I believe, and I do not have, if anybody is going to ask me a question afterwards asking how we're going to do this, I don't have an answer for you just yet. I believe it is possible for us as a sector to get much better metrics and outcomes measured across these different domains. So my challenge to my own team at Moonshot and to the sector within, and I'm going to run through the constraints we all deal with, within our obligations under GDPR and other privacy legislation that constrains the data that we can access, with all of the constraints, before I get more back to constraints, with our commitment to do no harm, because we need to ensure we don't have a counterproductive impact on people. Within all of the constraints that we have to operate with, what are the creative ways we can start to build that more nuanced evidence of the change we seek online? I think now's the time to do this, and I know there's been lots of conversations at TASM about generative AI. I know OpenAI facilitated a conversation earlier today on that. As we all think about what prevention looks like in the context of a model, a conversational dynamic, it is, and imagine all the ethical challenges that come with that, where it's so important that the model doesn't actually serve as a clinician, right? So even just thinking about what metrics will be possible in that context, it's going to be really challenging for all of us. I think evidencing these outcomes within a controlled lab setting for all the academics out there would nudge you in that direction. That might be straightforward. But to evidence these as practitioners in a robust and scientifically validated way in the wild, that's going to be really, really challenging. But we need to hold ourselves at Moonshot and also as a sector to a much higher standard of knowing precisely how and in what way we're going to achieve our objectives online. So, just to sum up, I invite all of you to challenge us at Moonshot. Please ask us tough questions about how we are measuring success, how we are doing this. And in our 11th year of operation, we are going to be spending a lot more time building out new and evolved measurement frameworks. And please, if you work on this topic, if you have ideas, we would love to collaborate with you, especially academics, on this. I also ask and invite all of you to ask these same questions of yourselves as you leave TASM. Are we building solutions for the threat environment that exists today, or for the one that existed when we started? Are we being ambitious enough about what we're trying to achieve online? And finally, are we measuring what matters, or are we just measuring what's easy to count? So, as I close out, here's to another 10 years of TASM. I hope another 10 years of Moonshot, but also just thank you all for the incredible work you are all leading. It's been such a great 2 days, and I've learned so much, so thank you.